Today we are starting our brand new series called The Echoes of Christmas. If you have a Bible, you can turn with me to John chapter 1 this morning. John chapter 1 is where the Apostle John, who walked and talked with Jesus, who knew Jesus, who watched him teach and preach and heal and do all the miracles that he did, who was very close to Jesus, begins to recap for people about the story of Jesus and what Jesus accomplished in his life, and about his life, death, and ultimately his resurrection, and then his ascension to God. And so John begins to compile in the book of John, that we now call the book of John, in his letter, John, all these ideas related to what Jesus has accomplished in his life. An echo, the echoes of Christmas. What is an echo? An echo is a repetition of a sound that happened at an earlier time. So if you yell into a cave and it echoes back at you ever done something like that? Like yelled into some place to just see how far it would go or what it sounded like? I remember as a kid we used to do that all the time, whether it was just in the bathroom or in some other place, we'd go and just try to echo and create that sense. An echo is a repetition of an original sound that happens. And Christmas ultimately is a reverberation from a sound context of something God decided to do from a very much earlier time in history. In fact, before human history, God decided that he would take his son Jesus and send him to earth to rescue humanity, to bring us into a relationship with him. If we would just believe and open our hearts to him, then we could have a relationship with him. And he decided that before we ever decided to walk away from him, even in the garden. Before we ever decided to walk away from him in our childhood or in our teenage years or in our adult years or even where we are right now. Maybe some feel like you've been walking away from God. Know this, God decided from the beginning to care about that and do something about it. So during this series, what we're going to do is we're going to go to the Old Testament and the New Testament. We're going to go back to some prophecy and things that happened before and then bring us right into the New Testament and the story of Jesus to show the correlation between God's plan and the fulfillment of his plan and what happened there through the life of Jesus Christ. John chapter 1, my message title today is The First Echo. We're going to start in John 1 and then pop into the Old Testament this morning. John chapter 1. Verse 1, reading together, it says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made, and without him nothing was made that has been made. And him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light, so that through him all might believe. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light." Verse 9. "The true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth." There are 4 Gospels in the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And each one of them start in a different place in the story of Jesus. We see Luke starting ultimately with Mary's family and the angel coming to Mary, and with Elizabeth and Zechariah and all the story and how it unfolds through Mary. Matthew starts in a different place than Luke starts. He starts with Matthew and the background of his family and the genealogy and all the people that came before, just showing all this planning that God had. God used that person, used that surprising person that nobody would have thought could have been used by God. And they're in the family tree, and he lays it all out and then gets to Joseph. And the angel comes to Joseph and then shows how Jesus came through the line of Joseph. Mark starts right in the ministry. He's like, I don't have time to start. And when he's a baby, like I'm not really into babies. So he starts like a little bit after that, starts right in ministry, and God's doing things through Jesus, calling him forth. John starts in a totally different place. All true, but all at a different beginning point. And John says, we've got to go back further. Some of you think the beginning of the story is when he was born, but it goes much further than that. And he begins with this little phrase. He says, in the beginning, which is no accident because there's somewhere else in the Bible that starts with the same three words, in the beginning. Anybody know where that is? It's the book of Genesis. It's the beginning of human history told through the Bible. The first words of the Bible, the first words of the book of Genesis are in the beginning. And John says, you know what? I've got to make clear to people who read this that Jesus wasn't just a great man, that he wasn't just a prophet, he wasn't just an amazing teacher, that he wasn't just a healer. And gosh, if he was only those things, we would have still been talking about him. But John says, I've got to make a deeper point about Jesus, not just where he came from, not just Mary, not just Joseph, though all those stories are so incredibly important. We've got to go back to the beginning, because in the beginning was the Word, he says. Remember in Genesis chapter 1, God begins to speak all things into existence, and he says there that Jesus was there in the beginning. Before his birth, he existed. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 through 3 is such interesting opening words to the Bible. The first three verses of the Bible says this: in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. You see that creation, right? In the beginning, God created. Now the earth was formless and empty, and darkness, this is going to be a theme today, was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said into darkness, let there be light, and there was light. John 1 is going to pick up on Genesis 1, but what's happening in Genesis 1? Genesis 1 is telling the story, where do we all come from? Like, where did my wife come from? Where did I come from? Where did my existence come from? Where did the earth come from? Where did the sun, moon, and the stars come from? Where did the fish in the sea come from? Where did the birds of the air come from? Where did all the animals come from? Where did all this come from? Did it come from someone, or did it come from nothing? How did it all come about? And Genesis 1 just plants the flag so deeply in front of everyone, says, we know where it came from. We weren't there, but he has told us it all came from him. He created all things. All things originated from his heart, from his mind, from his creativity. And he began to design everything and make all things work together until one day he planted a man and a woman in a garden. And they found their way in a garden, a paradise, and that's where it all came from. In the beginning, God created. And in the midst of creating, he doesn't have to do a lot of work. He doesn't sweat a lot. It's not hard for him to do. He just looks at everything that needs to happen. And what does it say that he does? He speaks it into existence. He says, there's no light. Let there be light. It just speaks to the power of God, doesn't it? I mean, I've never been able to speak anything into existence. I've tried a few things, like stop yelling at your brother. And it still hasn't worked. Like, that's how powerful I am. But God spoke everything into existence, and he says, looking at the world that was formless and void. And you see that's like without purpose, and it's just there, and it's nothing to speak of, and it's filled with darkness. And he looks into the darkness of the world in Genesis 1, and he says, I'm not okay with it being so dark. I'm not okay with it being formless and void and purposeless, like a lump of clay with no direction and no purpose to it. I'm not okay with that. And God steps into time in Genesis chapter 1 and says, let's change it. Let's make something out of nothing. Let's make out of that nothing something that matters and makes a difference. And I'm going to plant a man and a woman in a garden to represent who I am to the world around them and bring praise to my name. Genesis 1 is just such a powerful idea. So it's not okay with me. And so God moved, he spoke, and God's voice has been reverberating and echoing ever since that first day there when he said, let there be light. Such a big phrase. I was thinking this week about when I first came into relation with Jesus. If I'm just honest with myself, I wasn't really seeking Jesus when I came into relation with Jesus. I had been around church, going to church. My parents had done a lot of trying to investing in me, and parents in the room might know, like sometimes you try to help your kids catch faith, and sometimes they'll catch it, sometimes they don't, sometimes they catch it at different moments, but you plant seeds over and over again, and you pray that God would do with it what only God can do with it. And so seeds had been planted in my heart, but I slept through a lot of sermons. I hate to say, as a preacher, I slept through a lot of sermons when I was a kid growing up, a teenager especially, go to church, and I'd sleep through the whole thing. We drive an hour to church, by the way. And the church was about an hour long, and I'd sleep for most of the drive and most of church, and then we'd drive home for an hour. And then I'd wake up when I got home. It was like a 3-hour nap that we took all through Los Angeles. And I knew a bit of the Bible, and I knew a lot about the faith and the religion of Christianity and the idea of Christianity and the idea of Jesus, but nothing had really changed on the inside of me. It's like I was walking through all the motions and doing all the right things, and not a bad kid, but I just didn't have a sense that Jesus was really alive and that I really wanted to have a relationship with him. And I can't explain it any other way, but God got a hold of my life. And I went from like one day being that way to the next day, not having it all together, not knowing everything, but it's like a light was turned on. Anybody in this room ever felt that way from your faith perspective? Like at some moment, a light switch just turned on, and you can't really explain why it turned on at that moment and not a different moment, a moment before or a moment after. But for me, at least in my story, it's like a light switch just turned on, and suddenly I cared about things I didn't care about before. The Bible that was on the bookshelf of my room at home, then I'm like, well, my parents gave me the Bible, whatever. I pulled it out. I was like, I'm going to just read the Bible. And I committed myself, and I didn't want to tell anybody, because I didn't want them to hold me accountable to it. But I decided I'm going to read through the Bible, every word for myself. I'm not just going to believe what other people say about it. I'm going to see what it says, and then I'm going to make my own decisions. And within months of doing that, I started asking questions like, maybe I'm supposed to do something with my life like that guy at church does, that I always sleep through. Everything he says. Nobody's allowed to sleep here, right? That's why we caffeinate you all on the way in. You didn't know. That's like, we got a plan behind the scenes. Just there's a bunch of coffee out there. Get as much as you want. And my goal is to bring the scriptures to life and not be boring. That's the second part. But God just turned a light on. It's like at creation, God saw formless, void, lost creation in darkness. And he looked and said, this is not the way it should be. And he spoke, let there be light. And God has been speaking, let there be light, to people, billions of people ever since, who are just living life. And some point, God just gets a hold of them, and he turns the light switch on. And if that happened for you, you should just thank God. God, I didn't deserve it. I didn't earn it. I didn't even know where to find the light switch. And you turned the light switch on, and somehow in my heart, you spoke, let there be light. And I didn't know everything, but I knew more than I did before. And I cared about things, and I cared about Jesus in a way that I never did before. And you turned the switch on. Genesis 1, we just read it, we think it's just about creation. It's really about the nature of God. It's about the nature of God. Who is God? He's a speaking God who cares about things being as they should be rather than broken and dark and void of purpose. John, the author of John, who writes John 1, he's just God, by his power, uses John just to write one of the most beautiful books in the whole of the Bible, the book of John. And he starts it in a way no one else does, by the inspiration of the Spirit of God living in him. And he says, you know what? In case they miss who Jesus is, we've got to go back to the beginning. In the beginning was the Word. And people are like, yeah, the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He's like, don't miss that. He's not just a teacher, not just a prophet, not just a healer, not just a miracle worker. He is God who's come in the flesh. And where does he get all this idea from? I don't think he's just ingenious on his own. He remembered what Jesus said about himself. John chapter 8, verse 12, John records later in the Gospel of John some words that Jesus said about himself, because Jesus begins to speak some things like, I'm the gate, I'm the good shepherd, I'm the way, the truth, and the life, I'm the resurrection and the life. He begins to speak all these things. I'm the true vine. We just talked about that as a church over the last couple weeks. I'm the vine. He's giving all these word pictures because Jesus gave word pictures. But Jesus in John chapter 8 gives one more word picture, and he says, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. You hear that? See, God's always been a speaking God who's speaking light and life and truth into anyone who would receive him. And Jesus walked among us, and he taught about himself, and he showed who he is through his actions, but showed himself also through what he taught. And one day John was there, and Jesus spoke about himself. Who am I? You're not sure who I am? I'm the light of the world. The world without me is walking in darkness, but when I am present, they begin to see light where they had never found light before. And John comes back to write the Gospel of John and says, look, I'm going to write this so that everyone who hears it might believe for themselves. I'm going to write this masterpiece, the best that God will enable me to do. I'm going to write every word down, every moment I can remember, and I'm going to begin in the beginning. Not in the beginning of his birth, because his beginning was before that beginning. His beginning never had a beginning. That he's always existed, he's always been, and he was there before the beginning. Even in Genesis 1 is where he begins to get out. Verses 4 through 5 of John 1 have just been in my heart all week, and I just read them over and over again. I want to put them back on the screen here today. John chapter 1, verse 4. John takes it further. He says, in him, meaning Jesus, he's going to explain it later. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. You just see, you hear the repetition of the theme. In fact, he's going to say light 6 times in 14 verses. He's going to make sure, like, if you don't get anything else, catch that I'm saying that Jesus is like light in darkness. He says, in him was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Just love the power of that phrase. The darkness has tried to overcome it. The darkness has tried to push it down, but darkness can't hide light. It's just not possible. And Jesus is like light to darkness. Where there's darkness, apart from him, it remains in darkness. But when he's present, it just begins to change everything, the substance of everything, the way we see everything, the way that we live. And he says Jesus came into the world just like God spoke into the world from the beginning and created light where there was no light. Now he sent Jesus in the world and said, let's let there be light in a whole new kind of way. And Jesus showed up, the light of the world, to say, you know what? Darkness is going to try to snuff me out. It's going to put me on a cross. It's going to think it's going to win the victory. But you can't overcome the light of Jesus Christ. Yeah. So John's connecting all these dots, saying, who is Jesus? Jesus is God. He was with God at creation, but actually he's the one that God used to do all of creation. Like he wasn't a bystander. He was there making it all happen, and they were together in it, but he was the one that God used. God the Father used the Son, Jesus Christ, to create all things. And so if you exist, it's because he made you exist. He created you and gave you purpose, took what was void and formless and gave it a name and a story and a purpose. And where there was darkness, he spoke light into your life. What does John say about Jesus? He says he existed before the world existed. We call it that he pre-existed creation, that he's always existed. In some sense, he's an eternal, that he's never had a beginning. He'll never have an end. He's always been. He'll always be over all the people of all of history of mankind. And he's the one that brings light to darkness. He said about Jesus that he's superior to any teacher, any prophet, any rabbi, any healer, any miracle worker. He's superior to all of them because he's not just human, not just the son of Mary, not just the son of Joseph. Even if it would be incredible if she was a virgin birth, it's not just a virgin birth. It's not just that he did all these things. It's that he's always been, and he created all things. And at creation, when light was brought to darkness, now he's come to do it again. And so he's superior to all all people that have ever been in existence. He's superior to the angels, the Bible's going to say. He's superior to all things that are in front of us. And he created all things. And he's the Son of God who put on flesh. We call it the incarnation because he got incarnate. He got in flesh. He put on human flesh, not at his beginning, but just at his next phase. The incarnation where he came and walked and talked among us. And why did he do it? I just want to make sure we don't miss it here today. Why did he do it? He did all that to speak light to darkness. He said, God, I will go and let there be light where there is no light amongst people everywhere. And the problem is the human condition, the human heart is lost in darkness. This is the human condition. And I don't know where everybody is spiritually here this morning. Many of you, you might be a follower of Jesus Christ. You're like, yes, I know apart from Jesus, I felt there's a sense of darkness or shame or distance from God, and things just weren't right? Even in the world today, when I watch the news or I get on cable news or sports or whatever the thing, you just see darkness is all around us. People are harming other people, taking from other people. There's this human problem, isn't there? That looks more like darkness than it does light, more like death than it does life. And Jesus says, I've got to come and do something about it. How many of you ever got up like in the middle of the night, lights are all off, and you've stepped on something on your way to wherever you're going, getting a glass of water, going to the bathroom? Yes? Few people in the room? Okay, come on. Honest, we're at church. How many of you stepped on something? Yeah, you're like, do I really have to wave my hand and all that stuff? It just makes me feel better. I'm not the only one. So sometimes in our house, we have kids that leave things around our house and sometimes leave them in our room. Sometimes when I'm in the middle of the night and I encounter one, I feel like it's on purpose and I get angry about it, but it's really probably not on purpose. It's just an accident. The baby dolls are there, the little cars are there, whatever you run into in the middle of the night that jabs you in the bottom of the foot, and you're like, I'm just trying to go to the bathroom. I don't want to cry on the way to do that. What would work really well in the middle of the night if it didn't have all the other repercussions, you just turn the light on, right? If you could just turn the light on, you'd get where you're going, you navigate the things, because in the middle of the day, I don't step on random stuff that's on the floor. I don't harm myself. When the light is on, then I'm fine. But when the light is off, even if I think I know where I'm going, I might harm myself, I might harm other people, I might harm the direction of everything I'm going with. This is the bigger life conversation, right? Darkness. If my wife wouldn't get mad at me, I might turn the lights on in the middle of the night, but it'll wake her up, right? And Jesus came and said, okay, that picture is like humanity. Humanity thinks they know where they're going and how to solve their problem. They think, if I just be a little better, if I stop, if I forgive some people, if I let some things go, if I stop being bitter, if I just be a little better, then I think I'll end up where I need to go. God looks at us. I'm not as bad as other people, and if God's graded on a curve, then I'm on the good end of the curve, right? That's how humanity might think about things, but I think God would look at that and say, it's just like you think you know what to avoid, but you don't know what to avoid. You think you know exactly the direction you're going, but you don't really know the direction you're going. You really need light to get you where you're supposed to be. And Jesus said, humanity is going to keep trying to fix itself. But what's wrong with humanity can't be fixed by humanity. What's wrong with Brad can't be fixed by what's inside of Brad. And he said, apart from us doing something about it, you can imagine the God, the Father, the Son, the Spirit talking, dreaming, seeing everything before it happens, being all the way back. The Bible says actually the Lamb of God was slain before the foundation of the world. It's one of the most remarkable verses in the whole Bible to me. It's probably the verse that I just think about more than any other verse in the whole Bible because it means before he created everything, before Adam and Eve got to walk in paradise, by the way, and then they chose to break paradise and walk in darkness instead of light. Before all that, he saw it all. And he saw the decisions I would make and the decisions you would make. Some of them were going to be fine and good and be like, that's pleasing, that's a great decision. Some of which he knew the other side of the coin in all of our lives. But before all that happened, if you bring it all back, Father, Son, Holy Spirit all together, they decided that is not okay. And we have to do something about it. And you can imagine them having the conversation in Genesis 1, speaking, let there be light, and just knowing what they would know about what was going to happen in the future, about how Jesus would come, not just in a light in the world, physical light, but he was going to bring spiritual light to humanity. And they knew all the way from the beginning, we choose to fix what's broken in humanity, even though they're the ones that broke themselves, against all of our recommendation, against all of our commandment, against all of our desire for them to live right. They broke it, but we will fix it, and we will bring light. What is Jesus' mission? To speak light to darkness. What's part of our darkness? Well, pain and brokenness is part of our darkness. Our sin, our temptation, our rebellion, all part of our darkness. Death itself to humanity, the fact that we die, it's part of the darkness. We're trying to live longer, aren't we? I mean, scientists everywhere are trying to get us to live longer, try to prevent diseases, and as soon as we solve one that's taking people's lives shorter, another one shows, like that, we didn't know. We thought if we could just fix this, if we can fix the plague, then people will live longer. If we can do this, we can live longer, and then we realize the human body still wears out, doesn't it? I mean, there's been no solution to that problem. God says, the humans can't fix themselves. Their lostness, death, sin, pain, brokenness. And so I will do something about it. I will bring light to darkness. Jesus said, I will not only bring that, but I will bring hope to hopelessness. Humanity desiring to have a relationship with God, even not knowing what that is or how to get there or what we believe about God, but there's a general sense in humanity we're trying to find purpose. That's a sign that we're looking for God. We're trying to make our lives count for something. It's a sign that there's something inside of us. We're trying to find happiness and find a purpose for life. We're trying to do all those things. It's a sign that there's something inside of human hearts that's longing for a creator, a maker to explain his creation. But we were hopeless. We were separated and unable to fix it. And that's where Jesus steps in the gap and says, but I can fix it. I love what it says in verse 12, John chapter 1, verse 12, putting on the screen. He said, yet to all, well, first of all, verse 11, he came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. If I can just pause there for a second. It's one of the saddest verses in the Bible. And we could look at them and go, why didn't they receive him? But you know what? You and I, we got the same temptations to just do it our way, do it with our wisdom, our thinking, and not receive him, not allow him to come and have his way with us. I pray that wouldn't be true of me or us in our lives. He came to his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet, the hopeful verse 12, yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right, just a powerful word, to become children of God. These children are born not of natural descent, nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. See, the hopelessness in humanity is we're like, how do we get to God? Let's try to get to God. Early in the Bible, people try to build a tower to God. You think that sounds so foolish, but some of us try to find through happiness or through pleasure or through relation where we think we're going to get to some place that's going to satisfy our souls. We're longing for something that's missing in our hearts. How are we going to connect with God? God says, look, you can't connect with me on your own. I have to come and fix it. I have to draw near to you and give you a hope and a future. And he says, here's the deal. Some are not going to receive me. And that must grieve the Father's heart who decided to give his son from the beginning. Can you imagine that? They broke it, we'll fix it. But some aren't going to receive us. How do you even wrestle with that idea? Some aren't going to receive, but some are going to receive. And those who receive, they're not just going to be servants. They're not going to get into heaven and just at least get to watch what's happening. They're not going to be kind of in, but not really in. They're going to become sons and daughters of God the Father. Talk about hope. He speaks hope to the hopelessness of humanity, to not be able to have a relationship with God. We broke it, we can't get it back, but he speaks the fact that we can have the right to become children of God. And so who is Jesus? John's like, there's a lot we have to say about Jesus, but let's just start from the beginning. He created you. He knows you. He knows how to fix darkness, how to bring light. He knows your hopelessness. He knows your separation from God. He can bridge the gap. He can speak hope to hopelessness, both now and forevermore. John says, I love where everyone else started, but let me start in a different place so you can get a different idea about the fullness of who God is. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. And in him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light, so that through him all might believe. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light. But the true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who did receive him, hear the hope. To those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. And the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. I want to close here, because what does John say about God? He says he was with God and he was God, because he knew that they might think that he was just a great man to be talked about and not the God to be worshiped. But when you worship him as God and follow him as God, he brings light to darkness and hope to hopelessness, peace to anxiety. He dispels worry. He gives purpose where there's no purpose, where things are formless and void and empty and dark. What does he do? He says, let there be light. I grew up, my dad taught me to pray, I think just by example when I was young, and he taught me to pray, and he'd often pray, and he'd say at some point along the way, he'd be praying, and he'd say, and Lord, and to you, the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. And young, I was like, what is Alpha and what is Omega? Anybody ever heard something like that? Alpha and Omega. It's actually the Greek alphabet begins with alpha, it's like our A, and doesn't end with Z, it ends with omega. It's the beginning letter and the ending letter. It's an affirmation of the idea that Jesus is the beginning and the end, that he's always been and he always will be. And so John right here says he's the Alpha. You don't know it. You think he's like somewhere in the middle of the alphabet. He just came along to do some great things, but he's the Alpha from the beginning, and he'll be there at the end. And what I take away from that, because I'm human and we're part of the human story, is that Jesus is the Alpha and Omega of my story. He's the beginning and the end of my story. He's the one who saw me and knit me together in my mother's womb. And he's the one, if I will just open my heart to him, will come back to receive me to himself and take me to be with him forever and ever and ever. To him, the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, the one who rescues us from hopelessness and darkness and brings us into light. That is who he is. And that's why what we're talking about every week at Anthem Church matters so much, because he, as the center of everything that matters, and he's the one that can bring truth in the midst of a culture, a society, and our own human hearts that are lost as lost can be without him. Let's stand to our feet and let's pray all across this room.